Most of the money in the bag wasn't his. £4 belonged to Thomas of Navenby. The other 9 belonged to the King of England. And in 1367, he was carrying all of it down a road in Huntingdonshire when the light started to go. So he did the sensible thing. He stopped at an inn. He took a room with a lock on the door, put the money inside, and turned the key. By morning, it was gone. All of it. He sued the innkeeper, and he won. Nobody accused that man of taking it. Nobody proved he'd been careless with it. The court didn't ask for either one. An innkeeper was paid to take a stranger's money for a bed. What he was actually taking on was everything that stranger carried. 80 years after Navenby lost the king's £9, on the road running from the south coast of England up to London, one of the wealthiest institutions in the country spent £400 putting up an inn. It is still standing. Same street, same timber frame, and you can still walk in through the gateway they built wide enough to take a cart. So take the lease. We know what that building cost to put up. We know it to the halfpenny year by year across 11 years. What nobody has is one single record of what it earned. By the end of this, you'll know why. Start with the thing that would have frightened you most, because it's the thing you'd have understood least. The Navenby case fed into a principle English lawyers came to call the custom of the realm. Put simply, if you kept an inn as a trade, you could be held answerable for a guest's property without anyone having to show that you'd been careless. Not that you stole it, not that you left the gate open, just that it was in your yard, and now it isn't. 22 years before Navenby, a Londoner named William Bowback rented a locked room at an agreed weekly rate and put 10 marks in a strongbox. The strongbox disappeared. The innkeeper's own suspicion fell on his brewer, so he probably had a fair idea what had happened, and it made no difference at all to the outcome. The court awarded Bowback his 10 marks and 40 shillings on top in damages. He suspected his own staff. He paid anyway. You are not renting out a room. You are standing surety for whatever walks through your gate. Be careful how far you push that, because the law was still being built. As late as 1503, an English court recognized an action against an innkeeper who'd turned a traveler away, and the legal commentary around it stayed inconsistent for another century after that. This isn't a modern hotel with a modern set of obligations. It's a rule hardening slowly, case by case, over about 150 years. But the commercial shape of it was already there in the 14th century. In this business, a bad night doesn't cost you a refund. It cost you the full value of whatever your wealthiest guest was carrying that night. Nobody is insuring that. There is no policy, no underwriter, no pool. You are the insurance. Which raises a fairly obvious question about who would ever build one of these things on purpose. The answer is the richest institutions in England, repeatedly, at enormous expense. Your inn is in Andover in Hampshire, and its value sits almost entirely in one fact about the map. Andover is where the road from Salisbury and the southwest toward London crosses one of the routes running from Southampton up to the Midlands. 2 working roads, 1 town. That matters because of how far people could actually get in a day. Overland travel in this period ran somewhere around 15 to 20 miles, between dawn and dark, and individual journeys varied a lot depending on weather, load, and how many horses you were dragging. Which means a town sitting at roughly the right interval on a busy route isn't a convenience, it's infrastructure. Traffic stops there because traffic has to stop somewhere, and the geography picked Andover long before anyone built you a courtyard. This is not a monopoly, and you shouldn't run the business as though it were. Andover had at least 2 large inns while you're holding your lease. Yours, and one called the Bell, which belonged to Magdalen College, Oxford. A third, the Hart, shows up in the records by the middle of the next century. Somebody across the street wants the same cart you want. The town underneath all this was doing well, and had been for a long time. Andover was one of the centers of licensed wool export in the early 1270s, and when English merchants needed representatives to negotiate with Flanders, 2 of the men they picked came from there. By the 1460s, the local trade had shifted toward cloth, and Andover, counted together with Whitchurch, was producing or handling something over 6% of Hampshire's output. 70 years earlier, it had been around 2. So, a real town on a real road with money moving through it, which is exactly why, in 1434, it burning to the ground turned into an investment opportunity. The fire went through the upper part of Andover. It may have started in a butcher's shop in a yard off the high street, though that detail comes from later local tradition rather than from the accounts themselves. What the accounts do show is that nothing timber framed from before 1435 survived in the part of town it reached. Medieval towns complained about poverty constantly and strategically, so the useful measure of a disaster isn't what a town said, it's what the crown agreed to. Andover was let off the 15th and 10th completely in 1435 and again in 1437. It paid half in 1439 and half again in 1444. Nobody gives relief on that scale to a town that's exaggerating. Winchester College had held the rectory of Andover since 1414. Before the fire, it had been worth them an average of £59, 9 shillings and 8 pence a year, which made it one of the richest things they owned. Then a third of their tenants stopped being able to pay, and 7 properties sat empty in their hands. So the college did what an institution with cash does after a disaster. It went shopping. There are payments in the accounts to men named Robert Lyle and John Nelby for burnt-out property. In 1443, the college picked up 3 plots, 2 of which the record still describes as void ground, empty. Nothing on them. The bill for the general rebuilding across those years came to about £250, and that was before they'd started the thing they actually wanted to build. On the 4th of March, 1445, the warden of Winchester College, Robert Thurburn, signed a contract with 2 carpenters, Richard Holnurst and John Harding. Before the number lands, one thing needs saying, because people get it wrong constantly. Buying an inn that already exists and commissioning a new one are not the same transaction, and they never were. A modest going concern on a side street changed hands for a few tens of pounds. This was not that. The college consulted the king's carpenter at Eton over the design. They were reaching deliberately for the top of the market, and they paid accordingly. Here is what they spent, year by year. In 1445, £98, 19 shillings and 5 pence. In 1446, £61, 6 and 4. In 1447, £49, 15 and 7. £57 the following year. 51 the year after that. 66 in 1450, 53 in 1452. Then the spending starts to tail off as the work finishes. £25, £24, and finally in 1455. £2, 14 shillings and 10 pence to close it out. The whole program came to £544, 17 shillings and 6 pence halfpenny. The inn on its own accounted for about 400 of that. The carpenter's contract was £90, and the college supplied the timber and the carting itself on top. 11 years of building. The first rent arrives in 1456. John Hare, the historian who worked through these accounts, refuses to convert that £400 into modern money, and he's right to, so we won't either. Use his comparisons instead. A carpenter, in 1409, was paid roughly 5 pence a day. A large new barn put up at Overton in 1496 cost £47. Bishop Beaufort's entire lavish refit of the palace at Bishop's Waltham, one of the grandest building projects in the county, ran to about £1,000. And Winchester College's total income, across everything it owned, was somewhere around £450 a year. So an institution with that kind of money spent close to a full year of it on one building, in a small market town, and it did it at what turned out to be one of the worst possible moments of the century. Nobody involved knew that yet. You can reconstruct the place fairly precisely, because the carpentry contract survives, the building accounts survive, an inventory taken in 1462 survives, and a good deal of the actual fabric is still on the street. It's built around a courtyard. The front range facing the high street holds the hall and the gateway, with a cross wing at either end. Each wing has a cellar at the bottom, a parlor above it, and a chamber above that. Along the north side of the yard runs a range of chambers sitting over the stables and the kitchen. The south side is the same idea. Chambers over stables. Then there's the detail that gives the whole business away. At the back on the west side, they put in a second gate. Nobody builds a second gate for guests. Guests come in the front. You build a second gate so that a loaded cart can come in one end of the yard and go out the other without anyone having to back a horse and a wagon through a crowd. That gateway is a logistics decision, and it tells you what the college thought this building was for. Inside, a main kitchen in the north range and a second smaller one in the south. 2 ovens, coops for poultry, a space for storing victuals, stands for beer in the cellars, a well, and a stone fireplace elaborate enough that Hare notes stone fireplaces of that quality are barely found in Andover at the state at all. The inventory also lists a chamber with a name, the Christopher Chamber, which is a small thing, but named rooms mean rooms that people asked for by name, and that means rooms that cost different amounts. Because look at how the accommodation splits. Heated decorated chambers in the cross wings at the street front. Plain, unheated chambers over the stalls at the back. One building, 2 prices, sold on the same night to 2 sets of people who never had to meet each other. And the spending doesn't stop when the doors open. A new chimney went in during 1457. In 1469, 14 years after the place was finished, they built new stables next to the west door for £7, 8 shillings and 3 pence. One warning before we go further, because this figure gets misused constantly. There is a record of the Angel holding 91 beds and 15 fireplaces, and it's a real record. It's also from 1633. That's Stuart England, not medieval England, and if you see that number attached to a 15th century inn, Somebody has skipped 200 years. The building is the easy half to reconstruct. What moved through it is harder, and almost none of it is what's painted on the sign outside. If you've spent any time thinking about medieval hospitality, you already know the drink was never where the margin lived. The thing on the sign was the thing that got people through the door. In 1415, 4 ambassadors from Aragon, traveling with an unrecorded number of servants, spent 39 shillings and 3 pence over a single day in London. Their beds cost 4 pence, their hay, oats, and horse bread cost 129 pence. They spent 32 times as much on their animals as they did on themselves. It wasn't a one-off either. Same party, different stop. At Rochester, beds 3 pence, feed for the horses. 87. Now, be honest about what that account is. These were ambassadors, their dinner is not a typical customer's dinner, and their expenses are not a normal traveler's expenses. The evidence here isn't the size of the bill, it's the shape of it. And the shape holds further down the market. In 1331, a party from Merton College, a warden with 2 fellows and 4 servants, stopped at Alton and spent 27 pence and a farthing across the day. 13 of that went on bread, beer, wine, meat, and potage. 10 went on fodder for the horses, 2 went on beds. The rest was fuel and candles. That account comes to us through an old published transcription rather than a modern critical edition. So treat the precise farthings gently, but the proportions are the same as the ambassadors. Food, then animals, then a long way down, the beds. The Andover inventory records a room the clerk calls an ostery, which is almost certainly the ostler's own room. There are stables on 2 sides of the yard, mangers, and a barn for hay. You are not running a lodging house that happens to have a stable. You're running a fuel depot that happens to have rooms. When you want to know what a medieval business earned, don't read what it advertised. Read what Parliament tried to stop it doing. The Statute of Laborers in 1349 bound hostlers, along with brewers and bakers and other sellers of victual, to reasonable prices and moderate gain. Charge too much and you could be made to pay back double the excess. The local officials who failed to enforce it were on the hook too. Then, in 1402, Parliament came back and went after the horse trade specifically. A hostler caught making his own horse bread when he shouldn't have forfeited 3 times its value, and charging more than a halfpenny above the common market price for a bushel of oats exposed him to 4 times the liability. Parliament wrote a halfpenny into English statute law on oats. Legislatures do not do that unless a great many travelers are being taken on oats by a great many innkeepers, loudly enough that it reaches Westminster. And it wasn't decorative. In 1464, a Basingstoke innkeeper named Richard Kingsmill was prosecuted for selling horse bread and oats above the price. 17 years after that prosecution, no man in Basingstoke would be assessed higher on the value of his goods. What else was in the yard? 1330. The horses are only the second best business in the building. Inns turned into markets. At Basingstoke, innkeepers were buying up the fish before it reached the ordinary retail stalls, and then selling it on themselves. And the townspeople's complaint about it survives with the arithmetic still in it. Where the fishermen would give them 5 herrings for a penny, the innkeepers gave them 4. At Salisbury, the city tried to prohibit the sale of victuals in inns or secret places, or before broad day, which describes a functioning market running inside private gates before sunrise, and a city government that couldn't reach it. Some of this was formal. An ordinance at King's Lynn in 1363 gave official commercial hosts a share of a visiting merchant's goods, normally a 1/6, and a 1/3 on certain kinds of fish. Worth saying clearly that those hosts weren't necessarily the same people as ordinary innkeepers, and you shouldn't read that as a standard commission every innkeeper in England was charging. What it shows is that the system existed and had rates. And then, in the Parliament of 1439 and 1440, the whole arrangement got nationalized. Alien merchants trading in England were placed under the supervision of an English host. The host's job was to record what his guest imported and what his guest bought, and to report it to the exchequer, the stated purpose being to stop foreign merchants carrying English bullion back out of the country. The returns survive. They're known as the views of the hosts. They cover 1440 to 1440. 4, they come from London, Southampton, and Hull. And between them, they record somewhere around 2,300 individual transactions between alien and English merchants. By 1440, the man who took your horse was also filing a report on your cargo. The inn wasn't near the trade. It was inside the customs system. Your revenue then, a fuel monopoly on the road, a private market inside your own gates, and a legal position at the center of national commerce. That is as good as this trade gets. A prime building, a working road, a town with money in it. The Angel produced its first rent in 1456, £8, on a building that cost about 400. That's 2% a year. On rent alone, ignoring repairs, ignoring arrears, the college gets its money back somewhere around 1506, and £8 was the good version. Robert Cussey held the lease from 1456 to 1461, and he fell behind almost immediately even after the college reduced what he owed. They pardoned some of his debt against repairs he'd made. After his lease ended, his arrears were worked down to £7 10 shillings by 1464, and that £7 10 was still sitting on the college's books, unpaid, in 1480. 16 years. Thomas Fewer took over in 1462 on a stepped lease, £6 13 and 4 for the first year, £7 6 and 8 for the second, then £8 for the remaining 3. An introductory rate in the 15th century, offered by a medieval landlord who could evidently see the same problem you can. John Waterman came in 1467 and was supposed to pay 10. He did not pay 10. He'd been quietly holding back 13 shillings and 4 pence of it. And in 1475, the college gave up, cut the lease to £9 6 and 8, and formally pardoned him the difference he'd already stopped paying. The rent came down again in 1476, and once more in the 1490s. 4 decades of reductions, pardons, and arrears. And at the end of it, the college was still collecting about £8 a year, exactly where it started. One comparison makes the £8 look worse. The George on the High Street at Salisbury was returning £20 a year in 1418, 2.5 times the Angel, 38 years earlier, in a bigger town on a busier road. Andover was a good town. Salisbury was a better one. Location wasn't a tiebreaker between two similar assets. Location was most of the return. So why did the college keep doing this? Because 2% is only a bad number if you need the money back. Winchester College didn't. It was never going to die, never going to be wound up, never going to need the principal returned to a shareholder. By the early 16th century, it held inns at Alresford, at Botley, at Kingsclear, at Stockbridge, at Whitchurch, at Wells, in London, and at Andover. That isn't a portfolio chasing yield. That's an institution buying itself an income in perpetuity and not much caring how long perpetuity takes to arrive, which is the difference between the two men standing in this building. The college can wait 50 years. You have to eat this year. Go back to Thomas of Navenby and his locked door because you can read the case properly now. He wasn't compensated because the innkeeper was a thief. Nobody said that. He was compensated because of what that innkeeper had spent all day doing. Look at what was in that yard overnight. Other men's horses in the stalls, other men's fish in the cellar, other men's cloth stacked somewhere dry, carts in a courtyard behind a gate that locked, a room with a key that the innkeeper handed over personally. Every one of those is custody. That innkeeper had been taking responsibility for other people's property since the gate opened, as a trade, in public, for money. The law didn't invent that responsibility. It caught up with it. By the time the courts arrived, English innkeepers had been selling safekeeping for a century and charging nothing for it. That's the real fragility of this business, and it's an ugly one. Your upside is capped by statute. Parliament decided what you may add to a bushel of oats, and the answer was a halfpenny. Your downside is capped by nothing whatsoever. It's capped by whatever the wealthiest man in your yard happened to be carrying that night, which you don't control, don't know, and can't refuse. Navenby's stolen £13 included 9 that belonged to the royal treasury. On the arithmetic we've just been through, that single night's loss is more than a full year's rent on the best inn in Andover. A traveler you'd never met carrying money that wasn't his in a room you rented him for pennies. And that's the loss you can see coming. Underneath it sits the one you can't. Timber frame, 2 kitchens, 2 ovens, open hearths in a dozen rooms, tallow candles in all of them, and a barn packed with hay standing in the same yard. No source blames an inn for what happened at Andover in 1434. And I'm not going to imply one did, but you're operating a building of that description in a town that had already watched itself burn down once inside living memory. And then, on top of all of it, the economy turned. Winchester College committed £400 to this project, and then walked directly into the slump that ran through the middle of the 15th century. You can watch it land in their own numbers. The 3 houses they'd built alongside the inn were supposed to return £5 a year between them. By 1455, they were returning 4. Inn and houses together were expected to bring in £12 or more, which Hare points out was roughly what the college got from one of its smaller rural manors. A decade of construction, the most expensive thing they had ever put up in that town, and it performed like a modest farm in Wiltshire. Downstairs, in your half of the building, the same recession shows up as Cussey's arrears and Waterman's unpayable £10. Same downturn, 2 completely different timescales. Upstairs, it's a line in an account roll that recovers by the next century. Downstairs, it's the end of your tenancy and a debt that follows you for 16 years. 11 years to build, 2% a year, a rent that nobody managed to pay in full across 4 decades. Legal liability with no ceiling on it whatsoever. And yet there was never a shortage of men who wanted this lease. 2 men, same trade, same county, same 50 years. Robert Cussy walked away from the Angel owing £7 10 shillings, and it was still recorded against his name 16 years later. That's the ordinary outcome, and it's worth saying plainly, he wasn't a fool and he wasn't unlucky. He took a well-built inn on a good road in a decent town, and what he got out of it was a demanding household job, a fixed rent that didn't care how his year had gone, and a debt that outlived his tenancy. Then there's Richard Kingsmill. You met him earlier, being prosecuted in 1464 for overcharging on horse bread and oats, which tells you he was running his stable hard. The records describe him at various points as a grazier, a gentleman, and a yeoman. He dealt in cloth. He leased the Manor of Ash in 1472. In 1481, he had the highest assessment on goods of anybody in Basingstoke. He left at least 200 wether sheep in his will, and he was bailiff of his town, then a justice of the peace, then an assessor of the subsidy, then member of Parliament for Ludgershall. His son went to Winchester College, and then to New College, Oxford, and then into the law, and finished as a Royal Justice of the Common Pleas. None of that fortune came out of the inn on its own. Hospitality, cloth, livestock, and land made it between them, and the surviving records can't tell you in what proportion. What the inn did was put him in the room where all 4 of those things were being traded every night by people who traveled to be there. The inn was never really the asset. It was the access. And Andover's own records say the same thing in a quieter way. Edward Chamber took the lease on the Angel in 1496. He'd already been bailiff of the town before he ever got the keys. He didn't climb up through the inn. He was already somebody, and he bought his way into a good building. Cussy rented a building. Kingsmill used one. We know what the Angel Inn cost to put up, to the halfpenny, across 11 separate years. We know the carpenters' names, we know what the second set of stables cost in 1469, and which door they went next to. We know all of that for one reason. The landlord was an institution, and institutions keep books. What nobody has is the innkeeper's ledger. Not Cuss's, not Fewer's, not Waterman's, not one surviving year of what an inn actually took at the gate. No occupancy, no margin, no profit. It was never written down, or it was written down and thrown away, which amounts to the same thing now. Every one of these businesses has that same hole in it. The building survives, the owner's accounts survive, the record of the person who did the work is gone. The Angel still stands on Andover High Street. The accounts that paid for it are still in an archive in Winchester, itemized and complete. And the men who ran the business inside it reach us only through their debts, their prosecutions, and their wills.